Flames dance against the night sky, reaching toward heaven like desperate fingers. The roar of fire drowns out everything, almost everything. Through the chaos, a single bark cuts through the inferno. Not a cry for help, but a battle cry. A massive black bear rises on its hind legs, towering over a group of firefighters who stumble backward, their equipment scattered. Death looms in its eyes, but between them and certain doom stands a golden retriever, muscles tensed, ready to die protecting strangers. The bear's claws slice through the air where a firefighter's head had been just seconds before. The dog lunges forward, teeth bared, not in aggression but in pure, desperate love. This isn't just a dog fighting for territory. This is something far more profound, far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. But this moment, this impossible act of courage, was just the beginning of a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about the bond between species. A discovery that proved the threat was never the fire at all, but to understand how a family pet became the unlikely hero who saved lives and revealed nature's most profound secret, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I need you to do something. Drop your country in the comments right now. I want to see where our Wind Echo Untold family is watching from around the world. And if you're ready for stories that will change how you see courage, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, what you're about to discover will stay with you forever. Meet the Thompson family. Sarah, a wildlife photographer who moved to the remote Colorado mountains to escape the chaos of city life. Her husband Mark, a forest ranger who understood the wilderness like few others. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma, whose laughter could be heard echoing through the pine trees every morning. And Buddy, their 3-year-old golden retriever who had been with them since he was a puppy. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was Emma's shadow, Sarah's photography assistant, and Mark's companion on long forest walks. Every morning, he'd wake the family with gentle nudges, his tail creating a rhythm of pure joy against their bedroom walls. His golden coat caught sunlight like captured fire, and his eyes held an intelligence that sometimes made Sarah wonder if he understood more than he let on. The Thompson cabin sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest. It was paradise until the summer of 2023, when Colorado faced one of its worst drought seasons in decades. The trees, normally lush and green, had turned brittle. The air itself seemed to crackle with potential danger. Mark knew the signs. 20 years as a forest ranger had taught him to read nature's warnings. He'd installed every safety measure possible: fire alarms, emergency routes, communication equipment. But there was one early warning system he hadn't accounted for, one that would prove more reliable than any technology: Buddy's instincts. On the evening of August 15th, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows through their windows, the Thompson family had no idea that their peaceful world was about to be shattered. Emma was coloring at the kitchen table. Sarah was editing photos on her laptop. Mark was reading reports about fire conditions in nearby counties. Buddy lay by Emma's feet, his ears occasionally twitching at sounds only he could hear. His nose would lift, testing the air for scents that carried stories humans couldn't read. That evening, those stories were about to become a matter of life and death. The family that had chosen to live in harmony with nature was about to discover that sometimes nature demands the ultimate test of that harmony. It started with restlessness. At 9:47 p.m., Buddy lifted his head from Emma's feet, his ears rigid, pointed toward the north window. Sarah noticed first. Photographers are trained to observe details others miss. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, but Buddy didn't respond to her voice. His entire being was focused on something beyond human perception. The wind had shifted. Mark felt it too, that subtle change in air pressure that made experienced rangers nervous. He stepped onto the porch, and that's when he smelled it. Not the clean scent of mountain air, but something else. Something that made his blood run cold. Smoke, distant, but growing stronger. Inside, Buddy began to pace. Not the casual wandering of a bored dog, but the deliberate movement of an animal whose every instinct was screaming danger. He moved from window to window, his breathing becoming rapid, shallow. He'd go to Mark, then to Sarah, then to Emma, as if counting them, making sure they were all still there. By 10:15 p.m., the smell of smoke was undeniable. Mark grabbed his radio, contacting the ranger station. "This is Thompson, cabin 247. I'm detecting smoke from the northwest. Can you confirm any fire activity in Sector 12? The response sent ice through his veins. "Thompson, we've got a wildfire that jumped Highway 9 about 30 minutes ago. Winds are pushing it southeast. Evacuation orders are being issued for your area now." But even as Mark processed this information, even as Sarah began grabbing important documents and Emma's favorite stuffed animal, Buddy was already 3 steps ahead. He wasn't just agitated anymore. He was in full alert mode. The kind of behavior Mark had seen in search and rescue dogs when they'd located survivors. Buddy ran to the front door, barked once, sharp and commanding, then ran back to Emma. He gently grabbed her sleeve with his teeth and tugged. Not hard enough to hurt, but insistent enough that Emma looked up from her coloring. "Buddy wants to go outside," she said innocently, but Mark knew better. This wasn't about going outside. This was about getting out. The fire that was racing toward them through the forest wasn't just another wildfire. It was a crown fire, the most dangerous kind, jumping from treetop to treetop at speeds that could outrun a car. It had already consumed 3,000 acres and was moving with the fury of a living thing, fed by drought-dry timber and pushed by 40-mile-per-hour winds. What none of them knew, what no one could have known, was that this fire had done more than just burn trees. It had displaced something else, something large, powerful, and absolutely terrified. Something that was running through the same forest, driven by the same desperate need to survive. The collision course was already set. By 10:30 p.m., the Thompson family was in their car, following evacuation routes Mark knew by heart. But Buddy wouldn't settle. Unlike every other car ride they'd ever taken, where he'd curl up in the back seat with Emma, tonight he paced from window to window, whining, not the sound of a car-sick dog, but something deeper, more urgent. "He can smell the fire," Sarah said, trying to comfort Emma, who was getting scared by Buddy's behavior. But Mark wasn't so sure. He'd seen Buddy around controlled burns during his ranger work. This was different. The evacuation route took them along Forest Road 205, a winding mountain path that would lead them to safety in the town of Millbrook, 15 miles away. Other families were making the same journey, a slow-moving convoy of headlights cutting through smoke-hazed darkness. That's when they hit the first roadblock, a massive pine tree, weakened by the drought and pushed over by the fire's winds, had crashed across the road. Cars began backing up, drivers getting out to assess the situation. Some tried to move smaller debris, but the main trunk was far too large for anything but heavy equipment. Mark grabbed his radio again. "This is Ranger Thompson on Forest Road 205. We've got a major tree blocking the primary evacuation route at mile marker 7. We need emergency crews with chainsaws." The response was not what he wanted to hear. "Thompson, all emergency crews are fighting active fires. Estimated response time is 2 to 3 hours. 2 to 3 hours they didn't have." Buddy's agitation was becoming more intense. He'd stopped pacing and was now focused intently on the forest to their east. Not toward the fire, but away from it. His body was rigid, every muscle tensed, as if ready to spring into action. That's when Mark made the decision that would change everything. "We're going back," he announced. "There's an old mining road about 2 miles back. It connects to Highway 34. It'll take longer, but it's better than sitting here waiting." As they turned around, joining a growing line of vehicles making the same choice, none of them noticed the way Buddy's attention shifted. He wasn't looking toward the fire anymore, or toward the road they'd just left. He was looking into the forest, where something else was moving through the trees. Something large enough to snap branches. Something running in the same direction they were. The mining road was rougher than Mark had remembered. What had seemed like a reasonable alternative in daylight became a treacherous path in the dark, with smoke reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead of their headlights. The car bounced and lurched over rocks and through potholes that hadn't been there the last time he'd driven this route, but they were making progress. Behind them, other evacuees had made the same choice, forming a new convoy on this forgotten path through the wilderness. The fire was still behind them, its glow visible through the trees, but they were putting distance between themselves and immediate danger. That's when Buddy started barking, not the alert barks he'd been giving all evening, but something Mark had never heard from him before, deep, primal, territorial. The kind of bark that raised the hair on the back of your neck and reminded you that dogs were once wolves. "What's got into him?" Sarah asked, but before Mark could answer, their headlights caught something that made him slam on the brakes. Eyes. Massive, reflecting eyes staring back at them from the middle of the road. The black bear stood nearly 7 feet tall on its hind legs, its massive form blocking their path completely. But this wasn't the defensive posture of an animal protecting territory. This bear was terrified, disoriented, and desperate. Bone marks singed its fur. Its breathing was labored. And behind it, barely visible in the darkness, 2 small shapes huddled against a fallen log. Cubs. The bear was protecting cubs. Mark reached slowly for his radio, but the movement was enough to trigger the bear's defensive instincts. It dropped to all fours and charged toward the car, stopping just yards away, roaring a warning that echoed through the forest and made Emma scream. Buddy's response was immediate and shocking. He lunged toward the car window, not trying to get away from the bear, but trying to get to it. His barks had changed again, not aggressive, not territorial, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like communication. The bear stopped its charge, tilting its massive head as if listening. For a moment that stretched into eternity, dog and bear stared at each other through the car window. Then, without warning, the bear turned and lumbered off the road, its cubs following, disappearing into the forest on the opposite side from the fire. "Did that just happen?" Sarah whispered. But Mark was already putting the car back in drive, his mind racing. In 20 years of ranger work, he'd never seen anything like it. Bears didn't just back down from confrontations with humans, especially not mothers protecting cubs. And dogs didn't communicate with wild animals like that. What was Buddy trying to tell them? They reached Highway 34 at 11:45 p.m., joining the main evacuation flow toward Millbrook. The immediate danger seemed to be behind them. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the night's events. Sarah was dozing fitfully. Even Buddy had finally settled down, though his ears remained alert. Mark was focused on driving, following the stream of taillights ahead of them when his radio crackled to life. All units, we have a structure fire at the Millbrook Fire Station. Repeat, Millbrook Fire Station is experiencing equipment failure and structure damage. Evacuation center is being relocated to Riverside Community Center. The words didn't immediately register. Then their meaning hit him like a physical blow. The evacuation center, where hundreds of families were heading, where they were supposed to find safety, was compromised. The backup location was another 20 miles away, and with the fire spreading and roads congested, getting there would take hours they might not have. But that wasn't the worst part. The radio continued. "Be advised, fire has jumped Highway 34 at 3 locations. Evacuees should be aware that..." Static overwhelmed the transmission. Mark pulled over, grabbing his handheld radio, trying to reach the ranger station directly. Through broken, static-filled communications, he pieced together the reality of their situation. The fire hadn't just jumped Highway 34. It had surrounded it. They weren't evacuating anymore. They were trapped in a tightening circle of flame, along with dozens of other families who had made the same choices, followed the same routes, trusted the same evacuation plans. The mining road that had seemed like salvation had actually led them into a trap. But Buddy was awake again, and his behavior had changed once more. The agitation was gone. The desperate attempts to communicate were gone. Instead, he sat perfectly still, perfectly alert, staring not toward the fire, not toward the road ahead, but into the forest where they'd encountered the bear. It was as if he was waiting for something, as if he knew something no human could possibly know. By midnight, the situation had become critical. Mark's radio communications with other rangers painted a clear picture. They were in what firefighters call a pocket, an area partially surrounded by active fire with limited escape routes. The highways were compromised, the evacuation centers were overwhelmed or damaged, and new blazes were starting faster than crews could respond. But Mark had an idea born of desperation and 20 years of forest knowledge. There's an old fire lookout station about 3 miles north of here, he told Sarah, who had awakened as soon as she sensed the change in their situation. It's on high ground, cleared area around it, stone construction. If we can reach it, we can wait out the worst of this. It wasn't ideal. The lookout had been abandoned for years, and reaching it would mean leaving the main road, driving through forest on maintenance trails that might not even be passable. But it was better than sitting in traffic while fire closed in around them. Other families in their vicinity made different choices. Some continued toward Riverside, hoping to outrun the flames. Others stopped at a large parking area near a lake, deciding to wait it out in the open. Each decision was a gamble with lives. The Thompson family turned onto Forest Service Road 847, a narrow dirt track that led up into the mountains toward the old lookout. Their headlights cut through smoke and darkness, revealing a path barely wide enough for their car, with branches scraping the windows and rocks threatening their tires. But Buddy had become their navigator. Every time Mark hesitated at a fork in the trail, uncertain which direction to take, Buddy would position himself at one of the windows, ears pointed, body language indicating direction. Not randomly, not frantically like before, but with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where they needed to go. It's like he's been here before, Sarah murmured. Watching Buddy guide them through turns, Mark didn't remember from his map studies, but Buddy hadn't been here before. No domestic dog had any reason to know these remote trails. So how was he navigating with such certainty? How did he seem to know not just where they were going, but what they would find when they got there? The answer was approaching through the forest around them, following parallel paths driven by the same desperation, guided by the same inexplicable instincts. The bear and her cubs were heading to the same place. The fire lookout station emerged from the smoke like a ghost from the past. Built in the 1940s from local stone and heavy timber, it had been designed to withstand mountain weather and the test of time. More importantly, it sat in a cleared area, a natural fire break that had been maintained even after the station was abandoned. Mark parked near the building, and the family quickly moved inside, carrying emergency supplies and the few possessions they'd managed to grab. The structure was solid, reassuring after hours of uncertainty. Emma was fully awake now, excited by what felt like an adventure rather than a crisis, but Buddy wouldn't come inside. He stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, watching the tree line. Not anxiously, not fearfully, but with the patience of a sentinel. Every few minutes he'd tilt his head slightly, as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing. "Come on, boy," Mark called. "You'll be safer inside." Buddy turned to look at him, and in that moment Mark saw something in the dog's eyes he'd never seen before. Not the eager-to-please expression of a family pet, but the focused determination of an animal with a job to do. A job humans didn't understand. At 1:15 a.m., they got their answer. The radio crackled with an emergency transmission. "Mayday, mayday. Fire crew trapped on Forest Service Road 847. Equipment failure, vehicle down, requesting immediate assistance. GPS coordinates." The coordinates were less than a mile from their location. Mark grabbed his emergency kit and radio. As a ranger, he couldn't ignore a crew in distress, even with his own family to protect. But as he prepared to leave the safety of the lookout, Buddy moved, not toward the forest where the emergency was occurring, but to block Mark's path to the car. The dog sat directly in front of the vehicle, looking up at Mark with an expression that was unmistakably a command. "Wait, Buddy, move. There are people who need help." But Buddy didn't move. Instead, he barked once, sharp, authoritative, and turned his attention back to the forest. That's when they heard it. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps. And underneath it all, a sound that made Emma grab Sarah's hand. The huffing, snorting breath of something large moving through the undergrowth. The bear had found them, but as the massive form emerged from the tree line, Mark realized something that changed everything. The bear wasn't stalking them. It wasn't approaching the lookout station as a threat. It was arriving like a refugee. The cubs appeared behind their mother, and the family group moved to the far edge of the clearing, close enough to share the same safe space, far enough to respect the invisible boundaries between species. The mother bear looked toward the lookout station, toward the human family inside, then lay down in a protective position between her cubs and the surrounding forest. She was taking shelter in the same place from the same danger, guided by the same instincts that had led Buddy to navigate those forest trails with impossible accuracy. But the fire crew was still in trouble, and the emergency was getting worse. Mark's radio erupted with panicked voices. "Base, we got a problem. The fire jumped behind us. We're cut off. Vehicles overheated, can't restart. We're on foot, but the smoke is so thick we can't see 10 feet. GPS is giving us bad readings in these canyons." Then cutting through the static, "Base, be advised, we're not alone out here. Something big is moving in the smoke. We can hear it but can't see it. Sounds like. Jesus, I don't know what it sounds like. But it's getting closer." Sarah grabbed Mark's arm. "You can't go out there. Not with the fire, not with whatever's in the forest." But Mark was already calculating distances, terrain, likely positions. The crew was trapped in Deadman's Canyon, a narrow ravine that would funnel fire like a chimney. If he took the maintenance trail, he could reach them. But he'd be driving directly toward the fire, through forest that was probably already burning. Buddy stood up, moved to Mark, and did something he'd never done before. He grabbed Mark's jacket with his teeth and pulled, not playfully, not seeking attention, but with the focused intensity of a dog, trying to prevent his human from making a fatal mistake. "He knows something," Sarah whispered. "Mark, look at him. Really look at him." Mark did look, and what he saw was an animal that had been trying to communicate something crucial all evening. Every behavior that had seemed random or panic-driven now formed a pattern. Buddy hadn't been reacting to the fire. He'd been responding to something else, something that had been moving through the forest with them, around them, tracking parallel courses toward the same destination. The radio crackled again. "Oh God, oh God! It's a bear! Massive black bear, and it's..." The transmission cut to static. But the bear was right there in their clearing, lying peacefully with her cubs, 50 yards from where they stood. So what was threatening the fire crew? The answer came in Buddy's next actions. He walked to the edge of the clearing where the trail entered the forest. He sat down, facing into the trees, and let out a series of barks unlike anything Mark had ever heard. Not warnings, not calls for attention, but complex vocalizations that sounded almost like language, and from the forest came an answer. Not a roar, not a growl, but a huffing vocalization that matched Buddy's rhythm, his cadence, a response in the same strange language. The mother bear lifted her head, added her own voice to the conversation, deep, resonant sounds that harmonized with Buddy's higher-pitched calls. They were talking to something that was communicating back. "There's another one," Mark whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "There's another bear out there, and it's not protecting cubs. It's hunting." The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The fire had displaced not just one bear family, but multiple animals throughout the forest. While the mother with cubs had sought shelter and safety, another bear, a massive male, territorial and aggressive, had been driven into the same area. The crew's radio had gone silent because they were facing something that saw them not as fellow refugees from disaster, but as intruders in his temporary territory. Mark grabbed his emergency pack and rifle, making a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned. "I'm going after them. Mark, no!" Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. "You don't know what's out there." But Buddy was already moving. The moment Mark headed toward his vehicle, the dog was there, not blocking him this time, but positioning himself at Mark's side. His message was clear. "If you're going, I'm going with you. Buddy, no. Stay with Sarah and Emma." But Buddy had made his choice. As Mark opened the car door, the dog leaped into the passenger seat with a decisiveness that left no room for argument. This was happening, and they were doing it together. The drive through the forest toward the emergency coordinates was the most harrowing experience of Mark's life. Smoke reduced visibility to mere yards. Burning branches fell across the trail, forcing him to stop and clear the path, while Buddy watched the forest around them with laser-focused attention. The temperature inside the car climbed as they drove deeper into the fire's influence. But they weren't alone. Through the smoke and chaos, Mark caught glimpses of a massive form moving parallel to their path. The second bear, the male, was tracking them, using their movement to navigate through terrain that had become as foreign to him as it was dangerous. At 1:47 a.m., they reached the GPS coordinates. The fire crew's vehicle was overturned in a rocky ravine, steam rising from its overheated engine. Scattered equipment lay around the crash site, but there was no sign of the crew members themselves. Mark keyed his radio. "Fire crew, this is Ranger Thompson. I'm at your last known position. What's your current location?" The response came in a whisper. "Thompson, thank God. We're about 100 yards northeast of the vehicle, pinned down in a rock outcropping. The bear is between us and any escape route. It's been circling us for 20 minutes. Every time we try to move, it charges." Mark scanned the area through his binoculars, finally spotting the glow of emergency flashlights behind a cluster of boulders. Between him and the crew, barely visible through the smoke, was a shape that made his blood freeze. The male bear was enormous, at least 400 pounds, standing almost 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. Unlike the mother bear's protective behavior, this animal's body language spoke of pure aggression. Its ears were flat back, its mouth open in a continuous threat display. It was an apex predator that had been driven to the edge of its endurance by fire, smoke, and fear, and it saw everything in its territory as a threat to be eliminated. That's when Buddy made his move. Before Mark could react, the dog was out of the car, moving with purpose toward the confrontation. Not running away from danger, but toward it. "Buddy, no! Come back!" But Buddy wasn't running toward the bear randomly. He was approaching from a specific angle, moving to position himself between the aggressive male and the trapped firefighters. As he moved, he began vocalizing again. Those same complex sounds Mark had heard at the lookout station. The male bear turned toward this new challenger, and Mark's heart stopped. Buddy weighed maybe 70 pounds. The bear outweighed him by more than 300 pounds and could kill him with a single swipe of its claws. It should have been no contest, but something extraordinary happened. Instead of charging or attacking, the male bear paused. His aggressive posture shifted slightly, head tilted, listening to Buddy's vocalizations. And then, from behind them, came an answering call. The mother bear had followed them from the lookout station. She emerged from the smoke like a golden ghost, her 2 cubs staying safely behind her, and added her voice to Buddy's strange song. But her approach changed everything about the dynamic. The male bear's attention shifted from the trapped humans to the female and her offspring. His body language transformed from pure aggression to something more. Complex, territorial display mixed with what looked almost like recognition. Buddy positioned himself in the space between all parties, humans, male bear, female with cubs, and continued his impossible communication. His barks had become rhythmic, purposeful, as if he was mediating a conversation that transcended species barriers. The male bear responded, his vocalizations becoming less threatening, more questioning. The female joined in, her sounds taking on protective but non-aggressive tones. "What the hell is happening?" Came a whispered radio transmission from the trapped crew. Mark wished he had an answer, but Buddy wasn't done. His next action defied everything Mark thought he knew about animal behavior. The dog walked directly toward the male bear, stopping just outside the range of those massive claws, and lay down. Not in submission, not in defeat, but in the universal animal gesture of non-aggression. He was showing trust, demonstrating that he didn't see the bear as an enemy. The male bear stared down at him for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, incredibly, the massive animal also lowered himself to the ground, his threatening posture completely abandoned. In that moment, Mark understood what he was witnessing. The fire had created refugees of them all, human, dog, and bear alike. Buddy hadn't been trying to fight the bears or chase them away. He'd been trying to communicate that they all shared the same goal: survival. They all needed the same thing: safe passage through a landscape that had become deadly to everything living within it. The dog had somehow become a translator between species, a bridge between the civilized and the wild, facilitating cooperation where nature typically demanded competition. But the crisis wasn't over. The fire was still advancing, and radio communications indicated that their location would be overrun within the hour. The crew needed immediate evacuation, but the terrain and smoke made helicopter rescue impossible. That's when Buddy demonstrated the full extent of his impossible understanding. He stood up, looked at Mark, then at the bears, then began walking toward a break in the rocky terrain that Mark hadn't noticed before. Not the way they had come, but a different path entirely, one that led uphill, away from the advancing flames. The mother bear rose first, gathered her cubs, and followed Buddy's lead. The male bear watched for a moment, then also stood and began moving in the same direction. "They know a way out," Mark whispered into his radio. "Follow the animals. Trust me on this. Follow the animals." What followed was the strangest evacuation in Colorado Fire Service history. A golden retriever led a procession that included 5 human firefighters, 1 forest ranger, and 3 black bears through smoke-filled forest, along game trails that didn't appear on any official map. Buddy moved with absolute confidence, stopping at intervals to ensure everyone, human and bear alike, was keeping up. The bears maintained their distance from the humans, but clearly accepted the dog as a guide they could trust. When terrain became difficult, the male bear would find alternate routes and communicate them to Buddy with those same complex vocalizations. The mother bear kept her cubs close, but allowed them to follow the strange procession without fear. They emerged from the forest at 2:34 a.m., reaching a high meadow where the air was clear and the fire's advance would be stopped by natural rock barriers. Emergency vehicles were already waiting. Mark's radio communications had guided rescue teams to the location, but as the humans celebrated their escape and medics checked the crew for smoke inhalation and injuries, something else was happening that would change everything about how Mark understood the relationship between domestic and wild animals. Buddy and the bears were saying goodbye. The scene in the meadow looked like something from a nature documentary that no filmmaker would have believed was possible. Buddy sat in a rough circle with the 3 bears, their massive forms dwarfing his golden shape, but there was no fear. No aggression, no indication that they were different species with natural enmity. Instead, they seemed to be communicating in that impossible language Buddy had discovered, vocalizations that carried meaning beyond human understanding. The mother bear nuzzled her cubs, then approached Buddy slowly. She lowered her massive head and incredibly gently touched her nose to his. It lasted only seconds, but the intention was unmistakable: gratitude. The male bear, the same animal that had threatened human lives just hours earlier, extended one enormous paw toward Buddy. The dog approached without hesitation, allowing the bear to briefly touch his head, a gesture that looked remarkably like a pat of appreciation. "Are you seeing this?" one of the firefighters whispered, his voice filled with awe. They were all seeing it, but none of them could fully process what it meant. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gold and red, the bears began to leave. The mother gathered her cubs and started walking toward the higher elevations where the fire couldn't reach. The male lingered for a moment longer, looking back at the group of humans who had somehow become his temporary allies rather than his enemies. But before he disappeared into the forest, he did something that made every witness question everything they thought they knew about wild animals. He turned toward Mark, the ranger who had risked his life to help strangers, and vocalized, not a threat, not a warning, but what sounded unmistakably like a greeting. Acknowledgement from one protector to another. Then the bears were gone, melting back into their natural world, leaving behind only tracks and the memory of an impossible night. The investigation into the fire's cause would eventually reveal that it started from a downed power line during high winds, a common enough occurrence that typically wouldn't have displaced so many animals in such a concentrated area. But the drought conditions and unusual wind patterns had created a perfect storm that pushed wildlife from multiple territories into the same refuge areas. What couldn't be explained was how Buddy had known where to find safety, how he had navigated trails he'd never seen before, how he had communicated with wild animals in ways that prevented what could have been multiple tragedies. The fire crew's report, filed 3 days later, included a paragraph that became legendary within Colorado's emergency services. Evacuation was facilitated by unusual cooperation between domestic and wild animals. A civilian dog appeared to communicate with local bear population, enabling safe passage for all parties through unknown terrain. Recommend further study of animal behavior during natural disasters. But there were other discoveries that would take longer to fully understand. Sarah, the wildlife photographer, had been documenting their evacuation from the moment they left their cabin. When she developed the film weeks later, she found images that shouldn't have been possible. Photos of Buddy and the mother bear walking side by side through the smoke. The male bear waiting patiently while the firefighters navigated difficult terrain. All three bears looking directly at Buddy as he led them along paths that existed only in the knowledge passed down through generations of wild animals. Most striking was the final image. Buddy and the three bears silhouetted against the dawn sky, positioned in a way that made them look like a family group rather than natural enemies forced together by circumstance. Emma, now back in their temporary housing while their cabin was rebuilt, had started drawing pictures of their adventure. But her artwork revealed details that she shouldn't have been able to observe from inside the lookout station. She drew Buddy talking to the bears. She drew the bears showing Buddy the way through the forest. She drew all of them together in the meadow, with what she described as happy faces on all the animals. When Mark asked her how she knew these things had happened when she hadn't been there to see them, Emma's answer was simple. Buddy told me. 6 months later, the area had begun to recover. New growth was emerging from the fire-scarred landscape, and wildlife was returning to their traditional territories. Mark had been promoted within the Forest Service, partly based on his actions during the evacuation, but also because of his new perspective on human-wildlife interactions during emergencies. Sarah had been commissioned by National Geographic to document fire recovery in Colorado, her photographs from that night having attracted international attention from wildlife behavior experts. Emma had started a school project about animal intelligence that would eventually win the state science fair and lead to her lifelong interest in veterinary medicine. And Buddy returned to being the family dog who woke them up with gentle nudges and caught sunlight in his golden coat. But sometimes, when they were hiking in the rebuilt forest around their new cabin, Mark would catch him pausing, ears alert, as if listening to conversations humans couldn't hear. The bears had returned to their territories as well. But according to other rangers' reports, something had changed in the local wildlife behavior. Bears that had previously been aggressive toward human presence had become notably more tolerant. Conflicts between species had decreased dramatically in the fire recovery area. It was as if the night of cooperation had established new protocols for coexistence. Agreements reached in a language that transcended the barriers between civilization and wilderness. The scientific community struggled to explain what had happened. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an animal behaviorist from Colorado State University, spent months studying the reports, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing Sarah's photographs. Her conclusion, published in the Journal of Interspecies Communication, would become one of the most cited papers in the field. The evidence suggests that domestic dogs, through their unique position as intermediaries between human and wild environments, may possess communicative abilities we have severely underestimated. The Thompson incident indicates that under extreme stress, these abilities can emerge in ways that facilitate cooperation between species that would normally be competitive or antagonistic. But the most significant discovery came a year later. Mark was leading a training exercise for new rangers when his radio crackled with a familiar emergency. "Ranger Thompson, we've got hikers trapped by a rock slide in Sector 15. Can you respond?" Buddy, who had been lounging in the shade while Mark conducted his class, immediately stood up, ears alert. Without being called, without any command from Mark, he walked to the ranger vehicle and sat by the passenger door. That's the same behavior, Mark realized. He's doing it again. The trapped hikers were found in less than half the expected time, because Buddy led the rescue team directly to their location via a route that wasn't on any trail map but cut the distance by more than 2 miles. The dog had somehow known not just where to find them, but the most efficient path through terrain he'd never previously explored. During the rescue, other wildlife in the area, deer, elk, and even a lone black bear, showed none of their typical flight response to human presence. They watched from a distance but didn't flee, as if Buddy's presence had established some kind of neutral zone where all species could coexist temporarily. The pattern repeated itself 6 more times over the following 2 years. Every time there was an emergency in the forest, lost hikers, injured climbers, vehicles trapped by weather, Buddy would sense it before any human communication and guide rescue teams to locations with impossible accuracy. Each time, local wildlife would display unusual cooperative behavior, as if participating in a coordinated rescue effort rather than fleeing from human activity. The Forest Service began unofficially including Buddy in their emergency response protocols. His success rate in locating people in distress was 100%, far exceeding that of traditional search and rescue dogs who had been specifically trained for such work. But Buddy's abilities weren't limited to emergencies. Researchers who came to study the Thompson family's experiences discovered that Buddy could predict weather changes days before meteorological instruments detected them. He could sense geological instability that preceded small earthquakes or rock slides. He seemed to maintain an awareness of wildlife movements throughout the entire forest ecosystem. Most remarkably, other dogs in the area began exhibiting similar behaviors. Pets belonging to families who lived near the Thompsons started showing enhanced sensitivity to natural disasters, improved ability to locate lost objects or people, and decreased aggressive responses to wildlife encounters. It was as if Buddy's awakened abilities were somehow contagious. Spreading through the local canine population, Dr. Rodriguez expanded her research, documenting what she termed the Thompson effect, measurable improvements in human-wildlife cooperation in areas where dogs had been exposed to Buddy's influence. We may be witnessing the emergence of a new form of interspecies communication, she wrote, one that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, cooperation, and the hidden connections between all living things. But for Mark, Sarah, and Emma, the technical explanations mattered less than the simple truth they lived with every day. Their dog had become something more than a pet. He had become a bridge between worlds, a translator for languages that existed beyond human comprehension, a guardian whose protection extended far beyond their family to encompass the entire ecosystem they called home. The night of the fire had changed all of them, but it had transformed Buddy into something unprecedented. A domestic animal who retained his love for his human family while gaining the ability to communicate with the wild world in ways that served both. 3 years after the fire, Emma, now 11, and already planning her career in veterinary medicine, asked her father a question that had been bothering her. "Dad, do you think Buddy always had these abilities, or did the fire somehow give them to him?" Mark had wondered the same thing countless times. But watching Buddy play in their yard, chasing tennis balls and rolling in the grass like any normal dog, then suddenly stopping to listen to sounds no human could hear before trotting off to prevent a neighbor's cat from getting lost in the forest. Mark had developed his own theory. "I think," he told his daughter, "that Buddy always had the potential. The fire just created a situation where using those abilities was a matter of survival, not just for him, but for all of us. Sometimes it takes a crisis to discover what we're really capable of." Emma nodded thoughtfully, then ran off to play with Buddy, who was waiting by the forest edge with that patient, alert expression that meant he had detected something that required his attention. As Mark watched them disappear into the trees, Emma with her natural confidence, Buddy with his supernatural awareness, he reflected on how that terrifying night had ultimately given his family something precious. The knowledge that the boundaries between species, between domestic and wild, between possible and impossible, were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. The fire had threatened to destroy their world. Instead, it had revealed new worlds they never knew existed, connected by the universal languages of courage, cooperation, and love. As we reach the end of this incredible true story, I want you to think about something that goes far beyond the amazing events we've just witnessed. The night that changed everything for the Thompson family wasn't really about a dog with supernatural abilities. It wasn't about bears learning to cooperate with humans. It wasn't even about surviving a natural disaster that could have killed them all. It was about the moment when fear could have divided them, human from animal, wild from domestic, survival instinct from compassion, but instead became the catalyst for a connection that transcended every boundary they thought was permanent. Buddy didn't just save his family from the fire. He didn't just guide firefighters to safety or communicate with wild bears in an impossible language. He proved something that our modern world desperately needs to remember, that cooperation is more powerful than competition, that understanding can exist without words, and that courage often means building bridges instead of walls. Think about the choices made that night. Mark could have focused only on his family's safety and ignored the trapped firefighters. The bears could have seen humans as threats to be eliminated, rather than fellow refugees seeking shelter. The firefighters could have refused to follow a dog through unknown territory, trusting their training over their instincts, but each of them chose trust over fear, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. And that choice, that willingness to see beyond the obvious differences and recognize the shared needs underneath, created something miraculous. In our world today, we're facing our own fires, not forest fires, but crises that threaten to divide us, isolate us, make us forget that we're all sharing the same small planet, all seeking the same basic needs: safety, connection, purpose. Love Buddy's story reminds us that the solutions to our biggest challenges might not come from technology or policy or human intelligence alone. They might come from rediscovering the languages we've forgotten, the languages of empathy, of cross-species cooperation, of recognizing that survival and thriving are not zero-sum games. The Thompson family learned that their pet was capable of impossible things. But the deeper lesson was that they were all capable of impossible things when they worked together, when they trusted each other, when they refused to let fear make their decisions, every day in ways large and small. We're all presented with the same choice Buddy made that night. Do we build walls or bridges? Do we see threats or opportunities for cooperation? Do we listen only to familiar voices or learn to hear the wisdom in unexpected places? The research that emerged from this incident has opened entirely new fields of study. Scientists around the world are now investigating interspecies communication, the hidden intelligence of domestic animals, and the potential for cooperation in situations where we previously assumed only competition was possible. But the most important, research is the kind you can do yourself. Pay attention to the animals around you, not just pets, but the wildlife that shares your environment. Notice when they're trying to communicate something important. Listen for languages that don't use words, but convey meaning anyway. Look for opportunities to cooperate instead of compete. to build bridges instead of barriers, to choose trust over fear when the stakes are high and the outcome is uncertain. Because the truth that Buddy discovered that night in the Colorado forest is a truth that applies far beyond emergency situations. We're all more connected than we realize. We're all more capable than we imagine. And the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from finding ways to succeed together. The legacy of that fire isn't the destruction it caused or the property it consumed. The legacy is the proof that when we're willing to listen to voices we've never heard before, when we're willing to trust guides we never expected, when we're willing to cooperate with others who seem different from us, we can survive anything. We can even thrive in ways we never thought possible. So here's what I want you to do. First, if this story moved you, if it changed how you think about the connections between all living things, hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold. Stories like this need to be told, shared, and remembered. Second, tell me in the comments, what's the most unlikely cooperation you've ever witnessed? Maybe it was between different types of animals. Maybe it was between people who seemed to have nothing in common. Maybe it was your own experience of finding help in an unexpected place. I read every comment, and your stories inspire the research that goes into these videos. Third, and most importantly, go out and be like Buddy. Look for opportunities to build bridges. Listen for communications that don't use familiar languages. Trust your instincts about cooperation even when logic suggests competition, because the next fire, literal or metaphorical, that threatens your community might need exactly the kind of impossible cooperation that Buddy discovered that night in Colorado. The bears are still out there, by the way. Wildlife cameras have captured images of the same mother bear and her cubs, now grown, displaying unusual tolerance for human presence in their territory. The male bear has been spotted multiple times, guiding lost hikers back to established trails before disappearing into the forest. And Buddy, he's still serving as an unofficial member of Colorado's emergency response team, still bridging worlds that most of us didn't even know existed, still proving every day that the most profound connections often happen in languages we're only beginning to understand. The fire that threatened to destroy everything ultimately revealed that we're all more connected, more capable, and more resilient than we ever imagined. That's a truth worth remembering. That's a legacy worth continuing. That's a story worth sharing with everyone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey with Wind Echo Untold. Until next time, keep listening for the voices that speak in languages beyond words. Keep building bridges where others see only barriers. And keep believing that cooperation can triumph over any crisis. The wilderness is calling, and it has more stories to tell.